The late afternoon sun filtered lazily through the stained glass windows of St. Mildred's Church, scattering colored light across the rows of wooden pews. Outside, the village of Elmsworth lay wrapped in early autumn, with leaves turning to fire and copper, and the air touched by that first crisp bite of the season. It was Sunday, and as the church bell tolled its final echo, the congregation began to drift out onto the graveled path, exchanging greetings and the latest morsels of village gossip. Reverend Lenton's sermon was shorter than usual. Whispered Mrs. Vickers to her companion, a thin-lipped woman in lavender. "Praise be," the woman muttered, eyes darting past the church gates toward the green. "Though I'd wager it's because of that unpleasant business last Thursday." "She," Mrs. Vickers said, but her ears were clearly eager. The unpleasant business was a subject no one could quite avoid, though many tried. Mr. Thomas Partridge, a retired solicitor who lived in the handsome stone house near the duck pond, had died quite suddenly. Heart failure, the doctor had said. But the cleaner, Elsie, claimed he'd seemed in fine health just the day before. And now there were whispers, a broken window latch, a missing watch, and most strangely, a small crimson key found clutched in his hand. Miss Marple, who had attended the service as she always did, lingered near the churchyard wall, her gloved hands neatly folded over the handle of her umbrella. She had no intention of gossiping, but she did intend to listen. She watched as a knot of villagers clustered near the post office steps. Muriel Craik, the butcher's wife, was whispering with theatrical discretion to Mr. Hargreaves, who ran the grocer. A few feet away, Inspector Denham from the county constabulary stood awkwardly in his Sunday suit, nodding stiffly to passers-by and clearly wishing he were elsewhere. "Tragic," someone said behind her. "And yet odd, wouldn't you say?" Miss Marple turned slightly to see the speaker, young Lydia Partridge, niece of the deceased and the only living relative now residing in the house on the pond. Her pale face looked thoughtful rather than grief-stricken. "I'm sorry for your loss, my dear," Miss Marple said gently. "Thank you." "Uncle Thomas was a difficult man," Lydia replied, then paused. "But he didn't deserve, well, whatever that was." "Death comes for us all," Miss Marple murmured. "But it does raise questions when it arrives with a mystery in hand." Lydia gave a rueful smile. "You mean the key?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Just a little. A crimson key is rather a dramatic detail, isn't it? One might say, too dramatic." Before Lydia could answer, a commotion rose from down the path. A young constable hurried toward the inspector, whispering urgently. Denham's face stiffened. He barked an order, and both men hurried toward the village green. "Something's happened," Lydia murmured. Miss Marple turned her head and listened. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Someone had found something at the Partridge house. A second key, or maybe a letter. No one knew for certain. Yet, whatever it was, it had changed the tone of the day. The gentle peace of Elmsworth had been disturbed once again, and this time it felt like the beginning of something much darker. Miss Marple watched the constables disappear around the hedgerow, her mind already turning. People in small villages often assumed that quiet meant harmless, but evil, she knew, was not limited by noise or chaos. Sometimes it wore its slippers by the fire and spoke politely in church, and sometimes it left behind a crimson key. Partridge House sat at the edge of Elmsworth, a grand Georgian home with ivy creeping up its stone facade and leaded windows that caught the morning sun like old glass in a cathedral. The house had once been a source of pride in the village, until Thomas Partridge, a reclusive and occasionally disagreeable figure, had inherited it and shut most of the doors to visitors. On this particular morning, the gates stood ajar. Inspector Denham stepped through them first, notebook in hand, lips pressed in a thin, unhappy line. He was not fond of returning to scenes that were supposedly closed. But the call from the constable had been clear. Something had been discovered in the cellar. The constable led him down through the echoing hall, past a grandfather clock that ticked mournfully, down narrow servant stairs that smelled of old damp and coal dust. "Here, sir," the constable said, pausing at the base of the cellar steps. "It's behind the wine racks." A battered cabinet stood at the far wall, its doors open. In the center, lit by a single dangling bulb, lay a blackened envelope tied with red string. On top of it was a second crimson key, identical in shade to the one found in Mr. Partridge's lifeless hand. Denham frowned. "Where was this yesterday?" "Wasn't here," the constable replied. "At least, I don't think it was. Maybe hidden behind the rack. We were mainly upstairs." Denham bent down, gloved hands carefully lifting the key. It was heavier than expected, old-fashioned, with a number 11 engraved at the base. Untied the string on the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of thick writing paper, watermarked and neatly folded. His eyes scanned the letter quickly, and then he read it again. Slower. Upstairs. Lydia Partridge was pacing. She had been told to wait in the drawing room, where the fire had long gone out and the air smelled faintly of lemon polish. She tapped a finger against her skirt and glanced at the mirror. Her eyes were tired, and she had hardly slept since. Her uncle's death. He had been difficult, yes, controlling, private, even cruel in his opinions. But he had also paid her tuition, kept a roof over her head, and perhaps most galling, reminded her weekly of how indebted she was to him. Now that he was gone, she felt a strange emptiness rather than grief. She turned at the sound of footsteps. Inspector Denham entered, holding the envelope. "Miss Partridge," he said carefully, "may I ask, did your uncle ever mention a safety deposit box? Or a storage unit, perhaps?" Lydia blinked. "No, I don't think so." "Why?" Denham hesitated. "We found another key. It matches the one discovered with his body. And there's this note." He handed it to her. Lydia unfolded the paper. The handwriting was instantly familiar. Her uncle's precise, unfriendly scrawl. "If anything happens to me, look for the other key. It must not fall into the wrong hands. The past is not buried, and someone intends to unearth it." Her hand trembled slightly. "What does it mean?" She whispered. "That's what I intend to find out," Denham said. "Miss Partridge, was your uncle involved in any, let us say, questionable dealings? Was he afraid of someone?" Lydia shook her head slowly. "Not that he ever said. He was secretive, yes. Paranoid even, but enemies? I don't know. He didn't trust people." The inspector made a note in his book. Back at St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple was not idle. She sat in her parlor with a pot of tea cooling beside her, rereading a small clipping from the village notice board that she had, removed quite innocently and justifiably. After church. It was an old advert, hardly noticeable. But in the bottom corner, someone had scribbled a name, T. Partridge, and a date, underlined twice, August 12th, 1947. Odd, she thought. That date meant something to her. She rose and crossed the room to her small bookshelf, where she kept local almanacs, a battered copy of the Doomsday Book, and several carefully clipped articles from the Elmsworth Gazette. Her fingers found the one she wanted, an article about a fire at Rookstone Hall, many years ago, August 12th, 1947. She narrowed her eyes. The article mentioned a young solicitor, Thomas Partridge, who had provided legal assistance during the scandal that followed the blaze. The scandal involved lost inheritances, missing documents, and a young maid who vanished that same night. Miss Marple pressed her lips together. Something was beginning to form. A shadow in the shape of the past. In Elmsworth. The bells had tolled. Once again, But it was not for worship this time. It was a warning, soft, distant, and only a few would hear it. Miss Marple never considered her curiosity nosy, merely thorough. And if others spoke of her as a busybody, well, that was their business. She had found that listening quietly over a teacup often revealed more than any formal interrogation ever could. That afternoon she was invited, quite spontaneously, to tea at the vicarage by Mrs. Anne Clement. The vicar's cheerful, over-talking wife. It's all anyone can speak of. Jane, Mrs. Clement said, pouring generous amounts of milk into both their cups. First poor Mr. Partridge dies holding that red key like something out of a Gothic novel. And now the police are poking about again. Miss Marple accepted her biscuit with a faint smile. Do you know, Anne, I believe people have always been more fascinating when they're pretending not to be frightened. Mrs. Clement tilted her head. Frightened? Oh, do you think someone really killed him? The doctor said it was his heart. Doctors say many things, Miss Marple replied gently, especially when something looks convenient. Mrs. Clement lowered her voice. There are rumors, of course, about things from long ago. About his dealings in that dreadful inheritance scandal. You remember Rookstone Hall? I do, Miss Marple said, her fingers lightly tapping the side of her cup. A fire, and then something else. Mrs. Clement leaned forward. A girl disappeared. A maid, Rosie something. She was never found. Just vanished. Some people said she'd run away. But I always thought, well, no one disappears completely, do they? Miss Marple's face remained unchanged, but her eyes were quietly alert. She had not yet shared what she'd read in her newspaper clipping from 1947. But Mrs. Clement had just confirmed part of it. She would be about 70 now, wouldn't she? Miss Marple mused. Unless she didn't survive the night she vanished, Mrs. Clement said darkly. They sat in silence for a moment. Then, as was her habit, Mrs. Clement veered off toward the mundane. Oh, and did you hear about Lydia? She's staying on at Partridge House. She says she doesn't believe in ghosts or curses. Ghosts don't carry crimson keys, Miss Marple murmured. Quite right, Jane, said the vicar's wife. But you do think something's going on, don't you? Miss Marple gave a non-committal shrug. Let us say I find it unwise to rule anything out in a village. Later that evening, Miss Marple sat in her sitting room again, knitting untouched on her lap. She had been thinking of Thomas Partridge, not as he was in his final years, but as a young man, keen and ambitious, working on the legal affairs at Rookstone Hall. Just before everything collapsed, she remembered him being proud of his discretion, and perhaps too proud, and she remembered Rosie the maid, a sweet girl with quick eyes and a nervous giggle, not the sort to disappear without someone noticing. Unless she had been deliberately erased, Miss Marple stood and took down her old address book. She flipped through the pages until she found what she wanted, a contact in the county archives. She penned a short note asking for the Rookstone files, particularly staff records from the mid-1940s. Then she turned to the fire, watching the logs settle. In her experience, buried sins often surfaced not with noise, but with the smallest. Of signs, a torn envelope, an odd key, a whisper in the wrong place. Outside, the wind had picked up. A storm was coming to Elmsworth. Lydia Partridge stood at the window of the master bedroom, looking down at the lawn below, where shadows from the trees moved like long fingers across the grass. The moonlight was pale and indifferent. Everything about the house felt too quiet. Now, not peaceful, just hollow. She had lived here for nearly 2 years, helping her uncle after his fall. He never spoke much about the past, nor did he allow her to venture into certain parts of the house. The attic, the old study, and most strictly the cellar. Now he was gone, and she was free to walk wherever she pleased. But freedom felt heavier than she had expected. She turned away from the window and walked to the desk. The same letter Inspector Denham had shown her that morning lay beside the crimson key, the second one. She held the key in her palm again. It was cool, thick, and slightly tarnished. The engraving -11 seemed to pulse in the candlelight. It must not fall into the wrong hands. Why had he written that? What was he protecting? And who, in a quiet village like Elmsworth, could be so dangerous? There was a knock on the door. Lydia jumped. "Miss Partridge?" Came a voice, one of the constables, the younger one. "I've been sent to leave a copy of the property inventory." "Just a moment," she called, setting down the key. She opened the door, and he handed her a folded list. "I didn't mean to disturb you," he said. "Inspector says to keep this locked away. Just formal procedure." "Thank you," Lydia replied. He hesitated. "Miss, if you don't mind my saying, do you think your uncle was scared of something?" Lydia stared at him. "Because," he continued, "that key ... I think it opens a box somewhere. One of those old lock boxes. There are only a few left in the bank's secure vaults. The red ones were special, reserved for cases of high confidentiality. Or danger." "Danger?" "Espionage. Once, or blackmail. In the war days." Lydia nodded slowly. "Thank you." He left. She shut the door, bolting it this time. That night, Lydia dreamed of fire, old flames licking at walls, people shouting names she didn't recognize, and a woman crying in a language she couldn't understand. The woman wore a servant's dress. Her hair was dark. Her mouth moved, but no sound came. Then a key, a red one, appeared in the woman's hand, and she thrust it toward Lydia. "Take it," her eyes seemed to say. "Open the truth." Lydia awoke sweating. The candle stub burned out beside her bed. Elsewhere in Elmsworth, Miss Marple sat upright in bed, finishing the last few lines of a letter from her contact at the county archives. She read carefully. There was indeed a maid named Rose Danning employed at Rookstone Hall until August 1947. She vanished the night of the fire. No body was found. She was never listed as dead, only missing. One curious detail: in the records, she gave her birthplace as Vienna, and in a note scrawled in the corner of her employment record, the initials T.P. Thomas Partridge. Miss Marple folded the letter. She had suspected as much. Now she needed to know one thing. Had Thomas Partridge protected the girl, or destroyed her? She glanced at the clock. Midnight, and just outside the vicarage wall, a shadow moved through the hedgerow, carefully, silently, toward Partridge House. The next morning, the village was abuzz. Someone had broken into Partridge House during the night. Constable Bell, pale and flustered, stood just outside the front door, scribbling notes as Inspector Denham spoke briskly to Lydia. No sign of forced entry, he said, rubbing the bridge of his nose. But someone was in the house between 2 and 4 a.m. We found footprints near the garden window. Someone used the old side path. Did you see anything? Hear anything? Lydia shook her head. No. I was asleep. I had a strange dream, but Denham glanced sharply at her. Dream? Nothing important. Just fire, and someone holding a key. Denham said nothing, but made a note. Lydia hesitated. Inspector? Do you think someone's trying to find something? Or to silence it? That's precisely what I'm trying to determine. He looked over his shoulder at the study door. Did you leave this room unlocked last night? Lydia nodded. Yes, it was never locked before. Denham frowned. Then they wanted something specific. They were inside less than 10 minutes. By the look of it, the study's been searched, subtly but deliberately. Did your uncle keep anything particularly private in here? Only everything, she muttered. They both turned as Constable Bell reappeared. "Sir," he said, "found this tucked behind a false back in the top drawer." He held out a yellowed photograph, its edges curled. It showed 3 young people. One was unmistakably a young Thomas Partridge. The second was a striking man with a narrow face and intense gaze. The third, a girl with dark eyes and a solemn smile. Lydia gasped. "That's her. That's the girl from my dream." Denham raised an eyebrow. "I'm not sure how I know, but I swear it's her. I think her name was Rosie." Denham turned the photo over. On the back, in faded ink, were the words, "Vienna, 1946, TP, HS, and RD, Rose Danning?" Denham muttered "Miss Marple" when shown the photograph that afternoon, merely nodded. "She was very beautiful," she said softly, "but also afraid. You can tell by the way her hands are folded, not resting, but clenched, as though holding something inside." She studied the man beside Partridge. "HS. I know that face. Oh, yes. He came to Elmsworth once. Name was Hugo Stenner. The artist?" Denham asked. Miss Marple gave a faint smile. "A sort of artist." "More of?" "A charming parasite, really. Dabbled in scandal during the war, and always seemed to vanish just before trouble struck." Denham leaned back in his chair. "And now you think he's involved in this?" "I don't know," Miss Marple said. "But I do know that people rarely keep old photos unless they still matter, or unless they're afraid of being found out." That evening, Lydia returned home to find a new envelope pushed through the door. No stamp, no name, just her own initials scrawled in large, uneven writing. Inside, a single sheet of paper. "You are not safe in that house. The past is alive. Leave before it returns to finish what it started. No signature, no explanation." She looked out into the evening mist settling over Elmsworth. Somewhere in the dark, someone was watching and waiting. Miss Marple rarely visited people unannounced, unless the matter truly required it. That morning, with the sun weak behind thin clouds and the ground still damp from last night's mist, she walked briskly to the VICARAGE. Reverend Clement was in his study, sorting through old parish records when she arrived. "Miss Marple," he said warmly, standing to greet her. "To what do I owe this pleasure? I've just made some tea." "I shall not take much of your time," she said, seating herself near the hearth. "But I do have a few small, historical questions." He tilted his head curiously. "About the church?" "About Elmsworth," she said, "and Rookstone Hall." The vicar's face changed subtly, just for a moment. His expression shifted from interest to something like discomfort. But he nodded. "I haven't heard that name in quite some time." "No, I imagine most people prefer to forget it," Miss Marple said. "But I was recently reminded of a girl who worked there, Rose Danning. She vanished in 1947. You were here then, weren't you?" He sighed. "I was newly appointed. Young and perhaps not ready for everything that came with a parish like Elmsworth." "And you remember her?" He nodded. "Rose was quiet, very bright, and there were murmurs, the sort that don't appear in any official record." "What sort of murmurs?" Miss Marple asked gently. The vicar looked uncomfortable. "There was talk of a relationship between her and Mr. Stenner, Hugo Stenner, and possibly Mr. Partridge, too. No one knew for certain. But I remember the night of the fire vividly. I went up there to help. I remember seeing Mr. Partridge on the lawn. He was shaken, and Stenner had vanished by morning, just gone. And Rose? Never seen again. Son said she died in the fire, but no body was ever found." Miss Marple leaned forward. And what of the key, Reverend? A red key. Did you ever hear of such a thing? Now the vicar blinked slowly. Yes. Yes, I did. There was a story. That Rose had a key. It wasn't to the house. Something smaller, personal. She kept it on a chain, under her dress. I remember one of the maids saying it was for the truth. The truth? She said Rose used to whisper, "If anything happens to me, you'll find everything in the box." The red key holds the rest of my life. Miss Marple said nothing, but her expression grew sharper. And you never saw Hugo again? Not after that week. Rumor was he left for France. Some said Lisbon, but no one ever traced him. That evening, Lydia sat by the cold hearth in the drawing room, the mysterious note still folded in her hand. She had not left the house. She should have, but something stronger than fear had settled in her, a need to know. She could feel the weight of her uncle's secrets in the walls, in the rooms he kept locked, in the dreams that returned again and again at dusk. She lit a lamp and went to the small cupboard in the back hallway, the one she had never opened. Before inside, she found a tin box of receipts, an old pocket watch, and a leather-bound journal tied with twine. She hesitated only a moment before untying it. The first page held just a single sentence. In her uncle's spidery hand, "I never meant to hurt her, but I couldn't let the truth come out. Not after." What happened in Vienna? Lydia turned the page, her fingers trembling. Lydia Partridge read the words on the page again and again. "I never meant to hurt her, but I couldn't let the truth come out. Not after what happened in Vienna." The name Vienna had already surfaced twice now, once in the employment records Miss Marple had unearthed, and once in her uncle's ominous note. Whatever had happened, there had followed Thomas Partridge back to Elmsworth, like a ghost in the rafters. Lydia turned the page slowly. The writing was uneven in places, the lines occasionally crossed out or smudged. 1946. I was foolish, young and easily charmed. She had eyes like winter, and a voice that could make you forget where you were. I helped her leave Vienna under the false name of Rose Danning. It was illegal, but I believed she deserved safety, not questions. She said she had witnessed something, a betrayal among our own. Names, faces. She spoke of Hugo, of what he had done. She feared he would find her again. She said he had papers, stolen ones, dangerous ones. When she arrived in Elmsworth, I thought we could simply live as though none of it had happened. But she grew more afraid. She said she'd hidden something, proof of what Hugo had done. A lockbox. The red key. Lydia paused. Her hand went instinctively to the table beside her, where the second crimson key now lay inside a handkerchief. She turned another page. She vanished the night of the fire. The house burned, but not completely. They said it was an accident. I knew it wasn't, but I said nothing. I said nothing because I had already committed too many crimes of silence. If anyone finds this, know that she tried to do what was right. I did not. A blot of ink followed. Then nothing. The next morning, Miss Marple received a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. Inside was a copy of an old intelligence file, discreetly provided by her friend at the archives. A page had been flagged in red. Subject: Hugo, Stenerborn, 1919, Sussex. Occupation: freelance artist. Cover: travel: Vienna, Lisbon, Trieste, 1945-47. Alleged involvement in smuggling stolen. Allied documents post-World War II. Associated with Rose Danning, alias unknown, Thomas Partridge, solicitor, and unnamed third party. Status: unconfirmed. Last trace: Calais, 1948. Miss Marple closed the file slowly. This was no longer a matter of village gossip. It was espionage and betrayal. Later that day, Miss Marple called on Lydia. "I think," she said softly, "you should come with me." "To where?" "To speak with someone who might help you understand what your uncle never told you." Lydia stared at her. "You mean ... someone still alive?" "Not just alive," said Miss Marple, "but watching." As they stepped outside together, a man in a gray hat across the road turned quickly and walked away. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "He's been here before," she murmured. Lydia said nothing, but her fingers closed tighter around the crimson key in her coat pocket. The man in the gray hat had passed the bakery at exactly 3:30 each of the last 4 days. Miss Marple noticed it, of course. She noticed everything, including the way he never entered a shop, never stopped to greet anyone, and always carried the same slim, rolled umbrella, no matter the weather. That afternoon, she led Lydia not to the police nor to the vicarage, but to a quiet tea room on the far edge of Elmsworth, one few outsiders ever seemed to find. They sat by the window. Miss Marple ordered 2 pots of Earl Grey and a single scone. "Don't turn your head," she said softly, "but he's across the street, near the clockmaker's, watching us through the glass." Lydia's eyes widened. "Who is he?" "I suspect," Miss Marple said, "that he is someone who has spent a great deal of his life making sure no one knows who he is." A few minutes passed. The tea arrived. The man made no move. Then, as though summoned by thought alone, the shop bell tinkled, and he entered. Tall, narrow-shouldered, close-cut silver hair under his hat. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes, when they met Miss Marple's, held a glint of recognition. "I wonder," Miss Marple said politely, "if you'd care to join us. I believe you've been hoping for the opportunity." He hesitated, then nodded. He sat without removing his coat. "I'm told," she said, pouring him tea without asking, "that you may once have gone by the name Hugo Stenner." A long pause. "No? Once called me that in 30 years, he said quietly. Lydia stared. "You are him." He looked at her. "You're Thomas Partridge's niece." "I am." He gave a dry, humorless smile. "Then I suppose we're all here for the same reason." Miss Marple stirred her tea calmly. "We'd like to know what happened to Rose Danning." He stiffened. "I don't know." "That's not true," Miss Marple replied evenly. "She was afraid of you. She said you had papers." "She took them from me," he said suddenly, then lowered his voice. "She said she'd hand them over to the police. Proof of what I'd done. I tried to talk her out of it. That night at Rookstone, she ran. The fire wasn't my doing." "So, what was your doing?" Miss Marple asked gently. He looked at his hands. "Information. I stole it. Sold it. Nothing treasonous. Just ... profitable. But she knew. And when she disappeared, I assumed she'd gone into hiding. I didn't try to follow. I left the country." "You ran?" "Yes." Lydia leaned forward. "Then who killed her?" Stanner's eyes flicked toward her. "Killed? Who said she was dead? She vanished." "So did I. But she never resurfaced," Miss Marple said. "And someone is now trying very hard to stop us finding out what she left behind." Stanner looked pale. "Then you must already know about the box," he said. Lydia's heart skipped. "The lockbox?" "Yes. She told me, before it all fell apart, that she'd placed everything inside. Photos, names, letters. She said if anything happened to her, the truth would survive." "And the key?" Miss Marple asked. "She always wore it. Red. She said it matched the warning it held." Miss Marple gently touched her handbag. "Then I believe we may now have both keys." Stenner's gaze sharpened. "Where's the box?" "That," Miss Marple said, "is what I intend to find out next." Outside, the street remained quiet, but somewhere, behind one of Elmsworth's polished windows, someone else was listening. Later that night, As the rain began to fall in steady, whispering sheets over Elmsworth, Miss Marple sat alone in her sitting room. A worn map of the village spread out before her on the table. She had marked 3 places in ink: Rookstone Hall, or what remained of it, now reduced to crumbling walls and moss-covered ruins after the fire of '47. The Elmsworth Bank, where high-security vaults still existed for clients of a certain discretion, and Partridge House, where a journal hinted. At gilt and a crimson key waited to be used. She traced her finger over the final one. He said she wore the key, that it matched the warning it held. Miss Marple was not one to believe in superstition, but she did believe in codes, in symbols, messages, and people who spoke through objects rather than words. A red key was no accident. It was a message, a warning, and in Rose Danning's case, perhaps a final act of justice. The following morning, Lydia was already pacing the study when Miss Marple arrived at Partridge House, umbrella neatly folded, coat untouched by the rain. "Couldn't sleep," Lydia said. "I kept hearing things. I think someone's been in the garden again." "You should lock your windows tonight," Miss Marple advised. "But first, there's something we need to try." She produced both crimson keys, setting them on the table beside the journal. "There must be a place here," Miss Marple said softly, "where your uncle would have hidden something he couldn't risk anyone finding. I've searched the house." "You searched as his niece," Miss Marple said, "not as someone trying to catch him." They began in the study. Miss Marple tapped her fingers along the baseboards, her eyes scanning the floor with a quiet precision. The room was full of dark wood and dust-scented silence, broken only by the ticking of a mantel clock and the rain against the windows. Then her hand stopped. She bent down. The 3rd floorboard from the wall gave a strange, hollow sound beneath. Her cane. She nodded to Lydia. Together, they pried it loose. Below was a narrow wooden compartment, long enough to fit a shoebox. Inside it, wrapped in oilcloth and string, was a small iron lockbox. The surface was scratched, but the lock remained intact, circular, with a crimson ring around the edge. Lydia reached for the first key. It slid in with a satisfying click. The second. Another click. Miss Marple exhaled slowly. Lydia opened the lid. Inside lay a thin stack of papers, a faded photograph, a bundle of foreign currency, and at the bottom, a velvet pouch containing a single wedding ring and a short handwritten note. Lydia unfolded it. Her voice trembled as she read, "To whomever finds this, my name was not Rose Danning. My real name was Anneliese Rademacher. I was born in Vienna in 1924. I witnessed something that no woman should have seen, and I paid for it with my identity. If I vanish, it was not my choice. Please tell the truth. Please find Hugo, and forgive Thomas if you can." Lydia sat down slowly. "She was telling the truth," she whispered. "All of it. My uncle knew, and he let everyone believe she just disappeared." Miss Marple closed the box gently. She tried to escape with the truth. And now, all these years later, it's finally come to light. But what do we do now? Lydia asked before Miss Marple could answer. The study door slammed open. Inspector Denham stood in the doorway, breathless, coat soaked through. "There's been an incident," he said sharply. "We found someone unconscious in the woods, behind the ruins of Rookstone Hall." "Who?" Lydia asked. Denham looked grim. "The man in the gray hat, Hugo Stenner. And someone meant to kill him." The woods near Rookstone Hall were soaked and silent when Miss Marple and Inspector Denham arrived. The constables had already cleared a perimeter around the scene, a hollow beneath an ancient yew tree, where a man lay unconscious on a stretcher, his coat torn, blood matting the side of his head. Hugo Stenner. He was alive, but barely. "He was found around dawn," Denham said grimly, walking beside Miss Marple. "No ID, just his umbrella, snapped in two." Looks like he was struck from behind. Was anything taken? She asked. No. But the strange part is, whoever attacked him didn't search his pockets. Then they weren't after information. Miss Marple said softly. They were silencing him. Denham gave her a sharp look. And who exactly do you think he was planning to speak to? Miss Marple said nothing. But she was already forming a picture in her mind, not of Hugo as the attacker, but the attacked. It had taken courage for a man like him to return to Elmsworth after decades in hiding. He must have known it might cost him. They walked together toward the ambulance. A constable handed over Hugo's belongings in a clear pouch, a wallet with no cash, a passport in the name of Henry Stein, and a crumpled piece of paper with it. Single address, Partridge House, Elmsworth. Beneath it, tell her. Tell who? Denham asked aloud. Miss Marple already knew. Back at Partridge House, Lydia stared at the contents of the lockbox again. The wedding ring had an inscription inside. Small and delicate. Annalise, forever T. T for Thomas. Lydia sank into the old armchair by the fire, her thoughts spiraling. Her uncle had loved Rose or Annalise in secret, protected her, lied for her, or perhaps because of her Dot, and yet he had let the world forget her, and let a killer go unpunished. She turned the ring in her hand and murmured aloud, "Why didn't he save her?" Miss Marple, returning just then from the woods, answered quietly, "Perhaps he tried, but not enough." And guilt, Lydia, has a way of becoming a prison all its own. Lydia looked up at her. "Is Hugo going to live?" Miss Marple nodded gently. "Yes, for now. But time is running out. Someone here knows what Rose was hiding, and they're willing to kill to bury it again." Lydia swallowed. "What should I do?" Miss Marple walked over to the table and opened the journal again. She tapped a page near the middle, one filled with frantic writing and half-erased lines. "Never saw who started the fire. I only heard her scream once. It was meant for Hugo, but it found her instead. She must have known the truth by then, about the other man, the one who came after her, the one who was supposed to protect her." Miss Marple met Lydia's eyes. "This isn't over. And this next part may be the most dangerous of all." That night, someone slipped through the hedge behind Partridge House. They wore gloves, moved without a sound. They approached the back window, the study, and peered inside. Lydia sat reading the journal. The lockbox was gone, hidden now, and upstairs, behind a bedroom curtain, Miss Marple was watching. She had anticipated the intruder, and tomorrow she intended to lay her trap. Miss Marple had learned long ago that the best traps were never loud or theatrical. They were quiet, natural, like gossip at the grocer's, or a pot of jam placed ever so purposefully near an open window. So when she invited Reverend Clement, Mrs. Clement, Inspector Denham, and Lydia to tea the next day at Partridge House, she made it seem casual, even ordinary, but every word, every detail was intentional. She had even ensured the news had spread. "Miss Marple has found something interesting in the study," whispered the vicar's wife to Mrs. Mayhew at the butcher. "She's hosting a private little gathering about the murder. By 4 o'clock. All the guests were seated. Tea was poured. Plates of almond cake passed politely. Lydia, sitting straight and pale, had placed the crimson keys between the sugar bowl and the cream, right where no one could miss them. Inspector Denham, for his part, had arrived in plain clothes, but armed with more than curiosity. He now believed there was something far older and colder than greed at the heart of this case, and he had learned to trust Miss Marple's instincts more than forensics. Miss Marple stirred her tea once, twice. Then she looked directly at Reverend Clement. "Tell me," she said lightly, "did Thomas Partridge ever confess anything to you in those final days?" The vicar blinked. "No, Jane. I've told you, he rarely came to church at all. said Miss Marple, tilting her head. And yet he left this house only twice in the last fortnight. Once to fetch a package from the post office, and once to visit you. Mrs. Clement turned to her husband. Did he, dear? You never mentioned. Reverend Clement smiled thinly. Well, yes, but it was hardly a dramatic meeting. We spoke about Lydia's inheritance. Nothing more. Miss Marple nodded. Except he brought his will. Clement's smile faltered. How do you? I've seen a receipt from your office, she said, in your own handwriting, dated the day before he died. Denham narrowed his eyes. Miss Marple turned now to Lydia. Your uncle's second will, the one naming you sole heir, was signed in the vicar's presence, but it was never registered. Which begs the question, why? Lydia sat back, stunned. You mean ... it was invalid? I mean, Miss Marple said softly, that someone made sure it would never be submitted. She let the silence settle. Then added, the police confirmed that a bottle of your uncle's digitalis had been tampered with. Someone accelerated his heart condition, quite precisely. Mrs. Clement let out a soft gasp. Miss Marple placed her teacup down. I believe Thomas Partridge discovered the location of Rose Danning's lockbox in the final days of his life. And I believe he told the one person he had come to trust, or hoped might still forgive him, someone he thought knew the difference between sin and redemption. Her eyes moved once more to Reverend Clement. He stood slowly. This is absurd. I don't think so, Miss Marple said calmly. Because when you opened that lockbox, as I believe you did, the first night Lydia brought the keys back, you found not only proof of Hugo's crimes, but your own handwriting. And Rose's secret. Lydia was trembling. You knew her. The vicar turned toward her. She was my sister. The room fell silent. I kept it hidden all these years. She was illegitimate, born in Vienna during my father's diplomatic assignment. We had different mothers. No one knew but me. She came to England under a false name after the war, ashamed, frightened, and carrying something dangerous. He looked down at the keys, and she died because of it. Miss Marple's voice was very soft. You've lived with guilt for 30 years. But that wasn't enough. You couldn't risk it surfacing again. Not now. Not with Lydia about to inherit. Denham rose. You poisoned Partridge. The vicar said nothing. He simply removed his clerical collar and set it down on the table. Miss Marple folded her hands. I do believe, Inspector, that your trap has worked. Outside, the rain had stopped, and somewhere, far beyond the village of Elmsworth, a woman's memory stirred once more. The truth had not been buried. It had only been waiting. The following morning, Elmsworth awoke to more than just the soft bleating of sheep and the smell of rain-damp grass. Word of the vicar's arrest had already reached the high street. By the time Miss Marple returned from her early walk to collect her post, whispers were curling out from the bakery like steam. Mrs. Nash, the postmistress, leaned over the counter and said in a scandalized whisper, the Reverend. Of all people, it's like something out of the Times. Miss Marple only smiled faintly. The truth, she replied, has no respect for reputation. At Partridge House, Lydia sat in the rose garden, the lockbox beside her. It had been cleaned now, no longer hidden beneath floorboards, no longer a secret. Miss Marple joined her with 2 cups of tea. I don't know how to feel, Lydia admitted quietly. He was always kind to me, gentle. When my parents died, he visited every week. Yes, said Miss Marple. That's often how guilt behaves. It wraps itself in goodness, hoping no one notices what it's trying to make up for. Lydia turned the crimson key over in her fingers. Do you think Rose or Annalise would forgive him? Miss Marple thought for a moment. I think she would pity him, but forgiveness ... that must be earned, not presumed. And Thomas Partridge, for all his faults, did try to protect her memory in the end. He just wasn't brave enough to protect her life. They sat in silence as birds stirred the hedges and a soft wind rustled the roses. One of the flowers had been planted recently, a pale pink bloom near the east fence. Lydia looked at it curiously. "I don't remember this one." Miss Marple leaned forward. "Nor do I." They approached it together. The soil was still, soft, recently turned. Miss Marple knelt, gently brushing aside the mulch. And there, beneath the rose bush, was something metallic glinting in the earth. A silver locket, old, dented, and sealed. Lydia opened it with trembling hands. Inside, 2 photographs, one of Rose Denning, the other of a baby wrapped in a hospital blanket. On the back, etched faintly into the silver, Annalise -1947. My daughter, my last hope. Lydia stepped back as the weight of the discovery settled. She had a child, she whispered. No one ever knew. Miss Marple's voice was quiet. Perhaps someone did, and perhaps that's why she had to disappear. They turned to each other. "This changes everything," Lydia said. "There could be family, somewhere." Miss Marple nodded. "And perhaps ... a reason someone still wanted her secrets buried." Meanwhile, in a private hospital ward outside the village, Hugo Stenner opened his eyes. His face was pale, stitched. At the temple, his vision blurred. A nurse leaned over him. "You've been asleep nearly 2 days," he murmured. "The girl, the one from the house? She's safe." "No, the other girl," he whispered. "The baby. Rose's child. I never told anyone. The nurse hesitated, then said gently, "You can rest now." But Hugo Stenner knew he could not. The real danger had never been in what Rose saw. It was in who she left behind. The revelation of the silver locket shifted the atmosphere in Ellsworth. The village, always cloaked in a genteel calm, now buzzed quietly with new questions. Who was the child? Could any relative still be near? And who had such a strong interest in keeping this secret buried? Miss Marple sat in her cozy sitting room, surrounded by the soft ticking of the clock and the gentle patter of rain against the window. She reviewed the journal once more, her eyes lingering on the faint, hurried scrawl near the end. "If anything happens to me, find the girl. Protect her. The truth must live on." She sighed, thinking of Annalise Rose and the strength it must have taken to hide a child in those desperate times. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock. It was Lydia. "I've been talking to the village registrar," Lydia said, eyes wide with excitement and worry. "There's a birth record from 1947 for a girl named Eva Rademacher, born right here in Ellsworth." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Then the child survived, and someone in the village raised her. But no one's mentioned her before." Lydia whispered, "Because the past, dear, is often protected by silence and fear." The 2 women decided to visit the registrar together. The office smelled faintly of old paper and lavender. The clerk handed them a fragile ledger. There it was. Eva Rademacher, born November 1947. Parents listed as unknown. Miss Marple tapped a finger on the page. "We'll need to look deeper. School records, letters, anything." Back at Partridge House, as the day dimmed into evening, Lydia confided her fears. "What? If the people who tried to silence Rose and tried to silence Hugo are still watching? What if they come for Eva too?" Miss Marple placed a reassuring hand on Lydia's shoulder. "We will find her first." Far away, in a dimly lit room filled with photographs and maps pinned to the walls, a figure watched a newspaper headline. "Vicar arrested in murder investigation, village secrets unraveled." The figure's fingers curled tightly. "Soon," a low voice whispered, "soon the truth will be mine again." Miss Marple and Lydia spent the next morning in the village library, combing through old records and dusty newspapers. The story of Rose Danning, or Anneliese Rademacher, had been barely mentioned in local papers after the fire. The reports called it a tragic accident, and the missing woman was quickly forgotten. But as the day wore on, Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught a small, overlooked detail in a clipping from 1948, a brief notice about a foster child arriving in Elmsworth. Local. Family takes in orphaned child found near the ruins of Rookstone Hall. Child's identity unknown. The girl has been named Eva. Lydia gasped softly. That must be her, the girl from the locket. Miss Marple nodded. And that may be our missing link. They sought out the family mentioned in the article, the Harpers, who still lived on the edge of the village. Mrs. Harper, now elderly but sharp-witted, remembered the child vividly. She was a sweet girl, Mrs. Harper said, quiet, but with eyes that seemed to carry a weight beyond her years. Lydia asked gently, "Do you know where she is now?" Mrs. Harper hesitated. "She left here many years ago. Moved to London, I believe. Married, had children." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Then we may have found a thread to follow." That evening, back at Partridge House, a letter arrived, addressed to Lydia. No return address. Inside was a single sheet. "Be careful whom you trust. The past has claws. Some secrets protect themselves." Lydia read it twice, then folded it carefully. Miss Marple looked on quietly. "Someone doesn't want Eva to be found," she said softly. "Then we must hurry," Lydia replied, determination sparking in her eyes. Meanwhile, somewhere in London, a woman watched the news unfold on television, her expression unreadable. The mystery of the Crimson Key was far from over. Miss Marple and Lydia's search for Eva led them to the village post office, where the elderly postmistress recalled seeing a letter addressed to Eva Harper years ago. The letter had been forwarded to London, but no other details were known. Determined, Miss Marple wrote a careful inquiry to the address listed in the electoral register, a small flat in Camden, London. Days later, a reply arrived. The handwriting was delicate, but firmed out, "Dear Miss Partridge, I have waited a lifetime to hear the truth. If you wish to meet, come to 42 Listen Grove. -E.H. at 42 Listen Grove." Lydia and Miss Marple were greeted by a woman in her early 70s, her eyes bright despite years of hardship. "I'm Eva," she said simply. "I never knew my mother, but I grew up with the feeling there was more to my story." Lydia hesitated. "Your mother was Anneliese Rademacher, Rose Danning." Eva nodded slowly. "Yes, I found the locket in my things years ago. It was the only clue." Miss Marple observed the woman carefully. "You've been watched," she said quietly. "Has anyone threatened you?" Eva's face hardened. "Once. A man came asking questions about the key. I didn't tell him anything." Lydia took a deep breath. "We want to protect you, and finally bring the truth to light." Eva smiled. Faintly. "Then let's begin." Outside, unnoticed, a shadow watched the house. The game was almost over. Miss Marple, Lydia, and Eva sat in Eva's modest London flat, a single lamp casting soft light over scattered papers and photographs. Spread across the table. Eva traced a finger over an old photograph of her mother, Anneliese, taken in Vienna. "There's something else," Eva said, voice barely above a whisper. Before she vanished, Mother mentioned a man, someone who could expose Hugo Stenner, but she never named him. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "A silent ally. Someone who might hold the last piece of this puzzle." Lydia looked up. "Where do we start?" "Vienna," Miss Marple replied. "There's one place we haven't looked, the old embassy records. If the truth is buried anywhere, it's there." Back in Elmsworth, Inspector Denham received a call. The vicar had confessed fully, revealing details that confirmed much. but also raised new questions. But the investigation was now focused on one goal: uncovering the final truth behind Rose's disappearance and the secrets that had haunted the village for decades. That evening, Miss Marple walked alone through the village, her steps slow but purposeful. She paused near the ruins of Rookstone Hall, looking up at the sky. "The past," she murmured, "may hide many shadows, but it can never escape the light forever." Miss Marple and Lydia traveled to Vienna. Following the trail Eva had traced through old letters and faint memories. The city, still bearing the scars of war, whispered stories in every stone and alley. They visited the archives of the British Embassy, poring over dusty files and faded telegrams. After days of searching, they found a folder marked Operation Crimson, a covert post-war effort to recover stolen documents. Inside was a report detailing a spy ring involving Hugo Stenner and several others, including a man named Eric Weiss. Most intriguingly, the report mentioned a woman named Anneliese Rademacher who had tried to protect a child, her daughter, by hiding evidence in England. That evening, in a small cafe, Miss Marple and Lydia discussed their findings. "This Eric Weiss," Lydia said. "Could he be the man Anneliese mentioned?" Miss Marple nodded. "We must find him. He may hold the key to the final truth." Back in Elmsworth, shadows lengthened as the village awaited the return of its sleuth. But far from the quiet streets, someone watched Dot, and the game was far from over. Miss Marple and Lydia managed to locate Eric Weiss, now living quietly in a small Austrian town near the Danube. The man was older, his sharp eyes softened by age, but his mind remained as keen as ever. When they explained the situation, Weiss sighed deeply. "I knew Hugo Stenner," he said slowly, "and I knew Anneliese. She was brave, but trapped. The documents she protected could have changed everything after the war." Weiss revealed that Anneliese had confided in him about the spy ring and the danger she faced. "She feared for her child's life," he said. "And after the fire, she entrusted me with a list of names, people involved in the conspiracy. I kept it hidden." Lydia asked, "Can we see the list?" Weiss nodded and retrieved a worn folder from a locked drawer. Inside was a typed sheet. Names blacked out except a few legible ones: Hugo Stenner, Thomas Partridge, and a mysterious third name. Just initials. "MC." Miss Marple frowned. "MC?" Weiss shrugged. "Someone powerful. Someone who could move the pieces from the shadows." Back in Elmsworth, the village remained uneasy. The past was unraveling faster than anyone expected. Miss Marple looked at the list, determination in her eyes. The truth is almost within reach. The initials MC haunted Miss Marple's thoughts as she and Lydia returned to Elmsworth. There was only one person in the village who matched those letters: Margaret Caldwell, a reclusive woman known for her influence and wealth. Margaret lived in the grandest house on the outskirts, rarely seen but often whispered about in the village's corners. Miss Marple arranged a discreet visit at Caldwell Manor. The air was thick with old money and older secrets. Margaret greeted them with a composed smile, but sharp eyes that missed nothing. "I hear you're digging into matters best left alone," she said coolly. "We seek only the truth," Miss Marple replied gently. Margaret's smile faded. "Truth can be a dangerous thing. It can ruin reputations, lives." Lydia stood firm. "It's also justice." Margaret sighed and motioned them inside. "Very well," she said. "But be warned, some truths come with a price." Inside the elegant drawing room of Caldwell Manor, the air was heavy with anticipation. Margaret Caldwell poured tea with steady hands, her eyes never leaving Miss Marple's. "I was involved," Margaret began, voice steady but laced with regret. "Not in the way you think, but yes, I knew about the stolen documents. Thomas Partridge came to me, desperate to protect his family's name." She paused, gathering strength. Rose Annalise was a threat, not because of who she was, but because she held secrets that could destroy powerful people. Miss Marple nodded quietly. Including you? Margaret sighed. Yes, I helped cover it up. I convinced Thomas that silence was safer than truth. Lydia's voice trembled. And the fire? The disappearance? Margaret's eyes darkened. An accident that got out of control. I wanted to protect the village, our lives, but I never meant for anyone to die. The room fell silent, the weight of years pressing down. Miss Marple finally spoke. The truth is out now. It will bring justice, and I hope peace. Margaret closed her eyes briefly. I only hope it's not too late. The news of Margaret Caldwell's confession rippled through Elmsworth like a quiet storm. The villagers, once bound by unspoken fears, now faced the truth with a mixture of shock and relief. Inspector Denham moved swiftly to gather evidence, preparing for the formal investigation that would follow. Lydia found herself at the heart of a story that spanned decades, a story of love, betrayal, and sacrifice. Miss Marple watched quietly as the village began to heal. At Partridge House, Lydia carefully placed the crimson keys back into the lockbox. Now a symbol not of mystery, but of closure. It feels like a chapter has ended, Lydia said softly. Miss Marple smiled gently. And a new one is just beginning. Outside, the sun broke through the clouds, casting warm light across the garden. The first time in many years, Elmsworth breathed freely again. With justice set in motion, Elmsworth slowly returned to its peaceful rhythm. The shadows that had once loomed over the village seemed to lift, replaced by a gentle calm. Miss Marple sat in her favorite armchair, the evening sun filtering softly through lace curtains. Lydia visited often now, each meeting a quiet celebration of survival and truth. One afternoon, as Lydia prepared to leave after tea, she turned to Miss Marple. Thank you, Jane, for everything. Miss Marple smiled, her eyes twinkling. Remember, Lydia, the past shapes us, but it need not define us. Outside, children played along the village green, their laughter a balm to old wounds. And in the heart of Elmsworth, the crimson key rested safely, a reminder that even the deepest mysteries can be unraveled with patience, courage, and a steady heart. In the quiet English village of Elmsworth, a long-buried secret resurfaces when the mysterious disappearance of Rose Danning, known by another name, collides with the return of a shadowy figure from the past. As gossip swirls and old wounds reopen, Miss Marple's keen intellect and gentle determination begin to unravel a tangled web of betrayal, hidden identities, and silent threats. With a crimson key as the only clue, she must navigate decades of secrets to reveal the truth behind a decades-old murder, protect an innocent heir, and bring justice to a village forever changed. A classic mystery filled with suspense, emotional depth, and the enduring power of truth.